All politics is identity politics. Welcome to Identity Politics, everyone. I'm Kevin DeAnna. Over the weekend, USA Hockey defeated Canada for the gold medal, and we Americans had our fun, including, of course, the White House, with the usual AI slop coming from our beloved boomer commander-in-chief, with Trump himself fighting the Canadian team and winning the gold and whatever else. And, of course, progressives are shrieking hysterically because the male hockey team is going to the White House or the State of the Union or whatever else, and this is a hate crime or something like that. Who cares? What's really lost in all of this is basically what's happened to Canada over just the last few decades. And all the dunking on the Canucks really misses the point that what's happening to them is basically what's happening to us. Everybody says, oh, they're being overwhelmed by this Indian immigration. Well, have you seen Texas lately? Canada was this country that had this tremendous quality of life, and it's basically disintegrated in a remarkably short time. And just about everybody in the country agrees that things have gotten worse. It's a demographic transformation on a scale unparalleled in history, an almost inverse national identity where shame and self-hatred become national characteristics. And what happened after all this? The Liberal government was triumphantly reelected. People do not just naturally react. Accelerationism is not a thing. You have to actually offer them something different. There was no change. Now, a little later, I'll be talking to someone who is trying to change things, but it brings home something we've seen again and again. The quality of life can decline. Problems can get worse. People can agree that the problems are worse, and they'll keep voting to get it. Because one, they believe it's the right thing to do, mostly because that's what media, which is the real clergy, is telling them. And two, because there's no other solution possible. And this is the key for us. We're a few months from the midterms, State of the Union tonight, and barring something unprecedented, things are going to go very badly for Republicans in a few months. And unlike Republicans, Democrats are a serious party. So when they get power, they're going to immediately cripple immigration law enforcement. They're going to impeach the president. They're going to do all sorts of investigations, and that will be the story of the next few years. And like I've always said, it's not that Trump is so great. It's not that this is the golden age, but we are going to look back on this as the golden age. So we are not in a position to laugh at the Canadians because everything we're going to talk about is basically already policy in some states and probably will be in the entire country very soon. And ultimately, we are going to need radical change the same way they need radical change. And red states are not immune. For example, this is Governor Mike DeWine. This is a Republican. This is the Republican governor of Ohio telling the press that the state simply can't function without Haitians.
I think the policy to revoke that is wrong. I think there's a consensus in this country, as we all have said, let's get rid of the violent offenders, get them out of here. I think there's a consensus behind the need to do a good job on the border, and I think the president gets high marks for doing that on the border. But once you get beyond that, I don't think there's a consensus for taking people who are working, who are supporting their family. And we've kind of seen it in almost in a micro way with the Haitian community that's come into Springfield. Mm-hmm. Springfield is an industrial city, manufacturing city that was down. It has been coming back. And frankly, one of the reasons it's coming back is because of the Haitians who are working there. These are people who, if you talk to the employers, they were filling jobs that were not being able to be filled in any other way. So it's been a big boost to the economy. So if one day they know that TPS is taken away, no employer can hire them anymore. And so you got to have all these people who are unemployed. So I think the policy there is wrong. If I could just say this, I think that this is a real opportunity for the president in regard to immigration, probably after the election, because nothing's going to get done before
the midterms of 2026.
That's right. I think the president has a chance to do something that no president has done for 4 decades. If he would take that opportunity, and I think after the election he'll have a chance.
Now, did you catch that thing at the end? What is he talking about there? This is the first time the president could do something about immigration in 4 decades. Well, what was that a reference to? What he meant was the amnesty that Ronald Reagan passed. Our great conservative hero, right? 4 decades ago was pretty much exactly when you had the Reagan amnesty. Now, what were the consequences of that? America used to be a white country. California was a red state, middle-class paradise, birthplace of the conservative movement. Now it's a third world state. Why? Because of Ronald Reagan. You have millions of nons seething with hatred and resentment. You have an upper class that keeps the thing stumbling along. You have unbelievable levels of corruption. You have white flight from the entire state. And this was his contribution to history. This is all Ronald Reagan did. Forget the Cold War. Gorbachev destroyed the Soviet Union, and he did it by mistake. Reagan didn't do anything. Ronald Reagan made sure California would be destroyed. That's his legacy. That's his mark on history. And now we're here. And from a purely selfish point of view, knowing this history, you would think that as a Republican, as somebody on the right, you would think that somebody would see that and go, maybe we shouldn't make that mistake. But no, nobody learns. And Mike DeWine is one of these parasites who loves to do all sorts of philanthropy and Haiti. Oh, look at these schools. Isn't this amazing? The black kid can read. They're so much better than you. And this shows how much better he is than us morally. This is why they do it. But in terms of the practical consequences, in terms of the bottom line, think of what he said. We have factories, but the jobs can't get filled. Seems a little backwards, right? Like you have the factories to get jobs and you have jobs for your people. The people are supposed to be the priority. Ohio is a Rust Belt state, J.D. Vance's state. What has been the story of American politics, especially on the right, for 3 decades now? America's manufacturing base was gutted. The jobs were shipped overseas. Working class and middle class communities were basically nuked from orbit on purpose. And what is the response from the party that benefited most? We need to import foreigners to take the jobs that are left. And this kind of unthinking, this is just how it has to be. This is a very powerful school of thought. Not because it's coherent, not because it's intelligent. Of course, the jobs can get filled. We've seen the case after case. Even when a terrible place to work, like a meat packing plant, when that gets raided by ICE, you see citizens lined up to get jobs afterwards. But businesses don't want to raise wages. You don't have to raise wages when migrants get welfare and all sorts of benefits from NGOs that you don't get. And this doesn't include all the community-based fraud that being part of a tight-knit ethnic grouping allows you to get. Why do Somalis have all this money? Because you can just get unlimited grant money, as we've seen in Minnesota, as the Democrats are trying to do in Virginia. You don't get any of it. You can't pull that off. They can. Now, this guts the working class, but the left at this point is defined by anti-white hatred, so they don't care. Anyone in public education, NGOs, healthcare, any of these fields where you're administering programs for dependents, ultimately, this system benefits them. And it makes you feel like a good person. God knows it has the blessing of the churches for the same reason. And believe me, that's about the money too. And look at the way they talk about it. It's basically a fetish. There's something very weird and perverse about the way they talk about immigrants. Like Americans just can't do a job. It's just crazy to think that they can. It just can't be done. Houses, food, manufactured goods, these things didn't exist until 20 years ago, until Haitians came, until you had unlimited masses of nons from the third world pouring in. That's the only reason we have anything. We just didn't have food before. And Republican or Democrat, it's always justified in the name of the economy. This abstraction we are supposed to serve and sacrifice for no reason. It's not a real thing. And yet it's like a kind of God to both parties. So let's look at another guy, Tony Evers. This is the governor of Wisconsin. Now, this guy's a Democrat, former teacher and school superintendent, of course. His whole life is just administering over these failed systems. But look at the way he talks about these people. Watch.
If I had a chance and I knew it, and I knew it would have an impact, I'd tell them to leave the immigrants here in Wisconsin alone. They're the ones that milk our cows. They're the ones that work in our factories. If they go after those folks, our economy will implode overnight. He should know that. I mean, if he doesn't know that, then frankly, he shouldn't be president.
It's a fetish, right? I mean, this is insane. We literally owe them everything. The economy would just implode. Just, nope, we can't do anything. And this is the Democrat. This is the great champion of the workers in the Midwestern state. We're opposing the billionaires. Yeah, and he's lecturing his own people that they're useless and we need unlimited cheap labor. That's the Democrats for you. But the GOP is no better. Republicans go along with it because they fundamentally see their job as lobbying for business, and they just have no sense of political economy. They just are totally ignorant on the subject. The idea of what happens to the community, what about the culture, what about the strength of the country, the security of the country, even something like the long-term viability of the party and the ideas that I claim to believe in, like all this crap they service, this just doesn't even enter into it. They don't consider these things. And this is just me. I'm not going to counter-signal anyone who says, oh, they're bribed or they're corrupt, they're being blackmailed by Epstein, who's still alive, or whatever else. If you want to believe that, that's fine. Maybe it's even true in some cases. But I think the real truth is more horrific because it's not all of them, right? Like they're not all just bribed or have a gun to their head or something. They just don't think about it. They really are that stupid. It just doesn't occur to them. It really does not go any farther than the factory owner is making money. He gives me a contribution or just tells me that this is what they need. I am pro-business, I am free market, and therefore this is what I do. And if you bring up these other arguments, just in one ear, out the other, it doesn't even enter into consideration. And this is just inherent to democracy. No one in a position of power has any kind of a stake in the long-term viability of the country. It's just inherent to the system. The one guy in our system who is in a position to actually see the situation as a whole and plan for the long term is the president. And President Trump is at least trying to do something. And basically, you've got the entire government and the entire court system basically fighting him. Now, you can point to various ideas. You can point to the Frankfurt School about why this is happening. You can point to various left-wing radical networks and the influence they had. You can point to various ethnic lobbies, the Jewish one obviously being the most influential in recent history, and yet seemingly independent of history, independent of circumstances, independent of the economic conditions, independent of how all these programs are actually working out. It's like you have these people on autopilot. They just repeat the same things over and over again. And this is in every country. It's the same program everywhere. And it's not quite that, it's just a uniparty and both parties are the same. No, they're coming at it from different rationales. Certain constituencies are going to benefit more or less depending on who's in power. It still does matter at some level, but you're still ultimately ending up in the same place. Why? Because democracy is a system that is designed to prevent change. You cannot think long term. You don't have anyone who's actually in charge. The best you can do is just kind of grab things from the public treasury when no one's paying attention and use it to buy supporters. That's what the system is. And when you have a political force that is actually trying to make a systemic change, that is actually trying to make things better, something that everybody agrees needs to be done, you see every other political grouping rise in opposition to it. And such a challenge can really only come from the right, from the nationalist right specifically. And what happens? Every other political force basically unites against them. There's no cost to being a socialist. There's no cost to preaching class war. There's no cost to being a communist. But if you wave your own country's flag, that will get the entire political opposition united against you, just about in every single Western country. So you have this unbearable political show in the UK. I think it has this semi-clever name like The Rest is Politics or something. And they recently had former German Chancellor Olaf Scholz on. And it's not that the hosts are important. They're not. It's not that Scholz is so important. He's not. But what he says here and what the hosts are enthusiastically agreeing with, this is the conventional wisdom, absolutely everywhere. Every Western country in the world, you are not going to find people in power who disagree with this. Now here, he's talking about the rise of the alternative for Germany, the AfD. And by the way, for people who think at least some level of state control doesn't matter, I guarantee you that Germany would have just banned the party if Kamala Harris had won. The German government is absolutely getting pressure from the State Department to lay off, and the Trump administration is probably the one thing keeping X, and therefore Elon Musk, from being shut down in America, let alone in Europe. So you would not have even this level of opposition if Trump wasn't in the White House. But Scholz is talking about the AfD, and notice how he confirms what I'm talking about with democracy as a system designed to prevent change. Watch.
Your analysis as to why the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, have become such a powerful force within German politics. Where do you think that's all coming from?
First, it is necessary to state that they have now approximately 25% in the polls. This is not the majority. All the other people are thinking in a completely different direction. And this is why we agreed so far, and I hope we will continue to do so, that no one will cooperate with this party.
It's the Brandmauer, the firewall.
There is a firewall, yes, but it makes sense, not for keeping them small, because this is a question of political campaigning, of political debates, but to avoid that they are going to power. The most important critique I have on the AfD is not about the political position on the one or the other topic. This is open to debate in a democracy, it is that they are an anti-pluralistic party. And anti-pluralistic means that they are not accepting that all of us citizens are we. So they create a sort of a we, which excludes others.
But aren't you doing that by saying that they shouldn't have any position in government?
I just say that a party in a democracy must be in favor of democracy, and democracy is pluralism. And this means that you cannot get people out of the we that we are as citizens. The second is that we have a lot of doubts that if they would be able to reach power in the one or the other way, they would use this power for not being put out of power by democratic elections later.
So let's break it down a little bit. What do we have here? In a democracy, there's a we, and we have rights, but there's nothing else. Who is this we? Just people, biomass. There's no German people, certainly, not at all. There's no nation that exists outside the state. There's just the system. What does the system do? It conveys certain rights. But these rights don't actually give you anything, at least nothing important, because you aren't allowed to really decide anything. Democracy is defined, he says, by pluralism. So rather than the state being the political expression of the nation, the state becomes this purely bureaucratic entity that basically just traps you in the same system, this machine that's bleeding to death with all these other groups, all of whom hate you and all of whom you're paying for. And this is pluralism. I mean, in real terms, what is a pluralistic society? The group with the greatest amount of ethnocentrism and political cohesion dictates terms to everybody else. That's how pluralism actually works. And of course, the one group that isn't allowed to do this is the core national group. In Germany, the actual Germans. So what happens if you somehow manage to appeal to these people anyway? You win seats in government. Let's say 1 out of 4 voters support you, which is crazy in a multi-party system. Well, every other party just joins against you. And so now you can't do anything because democracy means pluralism, not the will of the people. I mean, forget this idea of the open society. Forget all the slogans you've been told, including by conservatives. Democracy is a closed system. It is a prison. There is no accountability possible. Maybe it doesn't necessarily have to mean that, but in practice today, that's what it is. It means that the core national community in any Western state is essentially prevented from having any political expression whatsoever. And before we sneer at the Europeans, oh, the continent is conquered, Europe is lost, I hate that crap. Remember, we Americans do not have a single explicit pro-white elected official that I know of anywhere in the country. You've got black nationalists in Congress, you've got state attorney general black nationalists, you've got mayors who are black nationalists, but we don't have anybody on our side. Now let's return to what Schultz has to say.
Analyze why is this happening? I have 2 reasons that seem important to me. The first is the success of globalization, which many people react to with some fear about their own future or people that are like them. And we saw it since the beginning of the 80s, when a lot of cheap, badly paid industrial production moved to many countries of the global south, especially, but not only China. Due to some statistic, the big majority of industrial production is now in the global south, completely different to the time before opening China in 1979. And so many people think, will there be good and well-paid jobs in 10, 20, 30, 40 years? The answer we could give is yes, if we do the right things and jobs with new technologies, and that will, because of this, give the chance of being successful. And it is not problematic if there are also wealthy people all over the world and not just in North of America and Europe and other places. And the second is one of the outcomes of our success when it comes to education. We should not forget that in the 50s, just a very small portion of the population had the chance to come to the highest outcome at school and to go to university. Now this is much more people, but we are still one country, and we should be. And looking down to others is a new phenomenon of the rich countries, which splits our society.
Now, if you're unfamiliar with recent German history, let's think about what party is this guy with? Is this guy a conservative? Is this guy a liberal? I mean, he could be either one, right? I mean, they all sort of sound the same. Now, this guy was a member of the Social Democratic Party. This is a very old party. It's been around since like the Second Reich, since Bismarck. This was the dangerous left-wing socialist party that Otto von Bismarck worried about. But now he sounds like the Republican governor, Mike DeWine. What are we doing here? We're talking about jobs. We're going to spread them overseas. We'll send them overseas. We'll make the economy more efficient. Like the very idea that you should take care of your own workers, which you would think a socialist would care about, like this doesn't even occur to him. It's not even worthy of mentioning, except that you shouldn't mention it because that will divide society. Oh, and here's the thing. If you think there's a problem with this, I'll tell you what's really happening. You catch that thing at the end? You're afraid. It's fear. That's why you don't want your jobs overseas. They always go after your nuts, right? This is how they come after you. Oh, you don't want your identity taken away? You don't want your job taken away? You don't want your country to be turned into a slum? You don't want all this degeneracy everywhere? You don't want crime and violence everywhere? What are you, a pussy? What are you, a coward? Why are you afraid? Be a man. Give your country away. What are you, a faggot? Like, this is how they come after you. And this is basically what's been done to Canada. Probably more than anywhere else. The scale of the collapse, the rapidity of it is almost beyond belief. Like, we Americans have basically been screwed since the beginning because we stupidly imported blacks here. And then, even more stupidly, we didn't send them away, as even Lincoln wanted to do following the war between the states. So, I mean, they're here and we have to deal with them. But Canada had it made. And while a lot of the decisions that eventually lead to all these problems that we're going to talk about were made decades ago, around the same time you had the Civil Rights Movement and the Hart-Keller Immigration Act here in the States, it's only been very recently that you've seen this sweeping societal transformation and disastrous consequences. I mean, the most obvious thing, let's just look at population growth. In 2000, not that long ago, Canada had about 30.7 million people. Last year, it had well over 41 million. That's a 35% increase, give or take, over a 25-year period, and pretty much all of that was due to immigration. According to Statistics Canada, so this is a government website, 23% of the population in 2021, so almost 1 in 4, were foreign-born. By 2041, the same source estimated immigrants could represent more than a third of the population of the country. And who's coming? More than 60% are Asians. Biggest contingent by far is Indians, then Chinese, then the Philippines. And it's important to remember, this is all legal. This is their skilled immigration. This is the kind of immigration they always tell us it's so good for the economy. This is what we need to compete. I mean, look at this chart. Look at the source where they're coming from. And again, there's no real opposition to this in the mainstream. So here's this guy, Doug Ford. Who's Doug Ford? This is this Canadian politician they tried to sell for years as like the Trump of the North, the right-wing populist champion. This is what he has to say.
I'm focused on Ontario right now. I've always said, and I've never changed my mind, when it comes to immigration, we need skilled immigration. We need economic immigration. So if you have a skill, please come to Ontario. We need more skilled workers. We need smart economic drivers as well. And I've mentioned to the Prime Minister, and all the premiers agree, you bring people over, you get them trained up for 2 years, and companies rely on them, and all of a sudden you get them and you ship them off. Well, that's not good for the economy. It's not good for our GDP. So my number one priority is making sure people here in Ontario get employed.
Now, again, in terms of where these people are coming from, this is from a government source, so I'm not just like making this up here. As recently as 1971, most of these immigrants were either Europeans or Americans. And then you can see the change. Now it's Asians, and more than 16% are Africans. Great. So they're importing this problem. Forbes reported in 2024 that Indians are immigrating to Canada in record numbers, more than quadrupling since 2013. And the article notes, quote, between 2013 and 2023, Indians immigrated into Canada rose from 32,828 to 139,715, an increase of 326%, according to the NFAP analysis. Indian enrollment at Canadian universities rose more than 5,800% in the last 2 decades, from just 2,181 in 2000 to 128,928 in 2021, an increase of 126,747 students. According to the 2021 census, so this is already dated, there's more of them now, there were about 1.85 million Indians in Canada. And that's well over 2 million now. That's about 5% of the total population. I've seen some estimates as high as 7%. There's more of them there than the entire population of some provinces in that country. And you've also got about 3 million non-permanent residents in Canada. But are they really non-permanent residents? No, because there's no real effort to track them down when their paperwork expires and nobody deports them. So to put that in perspective, 3 million non-permanent residents, that's 7% of the total population. And more than 28% of them are Indians, and another 10% of them are Chinese. Now, this is what they say, right? It's, skilled immigration, these are so great. And there might even be some people on our side like, well, they're not Somalis. well, they're not Haitians, right? Like, they're skilled, they know how to do things, they work. What has been the result of all this? Was it some great economic boom? Is Canada outperforming the world now? Well, no. The biggest story in Canada right now, like this is what they're talking about right now, is from the Globe and Mail. And they're soul searching because GDP per capita has fallen behind Alabama. And you know that hurts them. Because, oh, deep south, oh, these stupid Americans and everything else. Yeah, well, Alabama's richer than you are now. Quote, the timing of this report was terrible for the Canadian psyche. Home prices were on an astronomical trajectory. Inflation made everyday items such as groceries far more expensive, and there was deep resentment toward Ottawa. Canadians could probably stomach having their living standards slip relative to the broader U.S., the epicenter of the world's tech revolution. But Alabama? Unquote. Now, it's not that I think GDP or the economy is the most important thing. It's not at all. That's not what the show is about. But this is why it's important to talk about. This is what these people justify everything on. If you talk about culture, you talk about identity, you talk about race, you talk about national pride, any of these things, what are they going to say? Well, that's just, none of that really matters. What matters is the economy. What matters is economic growth. Well, you're not getting any of that. Like, even by your own standards, you're failing. There are no benefits to any of this. And yet they keep saying this is what we need. I mean, again, this is the economy. This is their measure. Real GDP has fallen way behind the United States over the last decade in Canada. Like, it's not even close. And this is at the time they're doing what all the smart people say we should do: skilled labor, legal immigration. So at the time they're praising how great this makes the country, it objectively is doing worse. So Royal Bank of Canada, and I think that's like the biggest bank up there by market cap, reported that basically, quote, Canada's economy might not be in a recession, but it feels like one. And it says, surging population growth has prevented outright declines in Canadian gross domestic product, but per person output is falling. And the unemployment rate is rising like it usually only would during a recession. Higher interest rates alongside decades high inflation in 2022, 2023 ate away at household purchasing power. Weaker demand spurred a rise in the unemployment rate of a size that historically only happens in recessions. And then we also find out, quote, decades high population growth has masked this recession-like economic backdrop. Canada has added 2.1 million additional consumers since mid-2022. And this is a small country. It's a lot of people. Real per person output has declined in 6 of the past 7 consecutive quarters, and unemployment has risen at the same time, unquote. So, what does this mean? From 2014 to 2024, precisely the time when you've got a liberal government, you've got high-skilled immigration, you're doing all the things that the smart people tell you to do, you're following the science, you're doing what the experts tell you to do, you have everything that you should lead to prosperity. What do? You get what they call a lost decade. So, the Western Standard reported on this idea of the lost decade, and they said, quote, Canada's GDP per capita growth from 2014 to 2024 was just 0.5%. The U.S. figure was 20.7%, according to the IMF's World Economic Outlook report from October 2024. The figure indicates an average annual growth rate of approximately 0.05% over the decade, reflecting a period of economic stagnation under the Trudeau Liberals on a per-person basis, unquote. And this is a chart from the same article. And you can see how pathetic the growth is compared to literally everybody else. Now, why spurg about this? Because this is the ultimate example of what they tell you they want. Not just in Canada, but in America, and in Europe, and in everywhere else. Australia and New Zealand are paying the same thing. And here's the key. Again, it's not illegal immigration. Yeah, they've got all the temporary residents that they know have no intention of removing. That's not really a point, though. These are your legal immigrants. These are your skilled immigrants. These are the ones who have a college degree and everything else. These are the people that we absolutely have to have. This is what it means to compete and everything else. This is what economic growth depends on. And what happened? The economy didn't grow. People got worse off. The housing costs skyrocketed. The country is objectively worse. Now, for what it's worth, right now, the economy up there is not in recession, but that's basically because the government is spending more, in response to Trump, by the way. So the Wall Street Journal, just very briefly, in an article basically trying to gas you up, saying it's doing better than expected, said, quote, "The rebound confirms Canada avoided a technical recession characterized by back-to-back quarterly contractions after GDP in the second quarter retreated a revised 1.8% when exports slumped in the wake of the U.S. administration's tariffs. However, the economy beneath the surface continues to show signs of struggling, and the final quarter of 2025 began on shaky footing. Growth in the third quarter owed much to a sharp drop in imports, the first decline since the final quarter of 2022. Exports nudged higher, which counted as a boost to the economy since the trade balance strengthened. The country's terms of trade, the net income pocketed from the sale of exports, grew 1%, the largest increase since the third quarter of 2023, thanks to a lift in export prices, particularly for energy products. Government investment also was up strongly, led by a significant rise in spending on weapons systems, as well as investment in institutional buildings such as hospitals," unquote. So what are we talking about here? Basically, yeah, if you just dump a bunch of taxpayer money into the economy, you can stave off recession for a quarter. Oh, and by the way, energy, where's that? Alberta. What's the part of Canada that wants to break away and possibly even join the United States? Alberta. So none of this is actually coming from the sources that they say we're going to grow the economy. This is all fake. And think of the cost of living. Imagine you're just like a young Canadian. Canada has way higher levels of household debt, and debt is a huge problem here, but there it's much worse. And again, this is all based on government statistics. This isn't me coming up with it. And housing prices are basically one of the biggest complaints among young Canadians right now. Now, it's down a little bit. I'm not trying to BS you. I'm not like, oh, everything's falling apart. You can see in this chart, this is coming from the St. Louis Fed, that housing prices are coming down somewhat. But that's just because the economy sucks so much that people can't afford any of it. And by the way, like, well, people are mad. And you look at poll after poll after poll. They all say, oh, they're upset about this. People can't afford anything. This country's falling apart. But the Liberals were triumphantly reelected, mostly on the backs of votes from older people. Why? Because these are the people who are going to benefit from what's going on. In any system, there is a privileged class. Like, the woke are more correct than the mainstream in that respect. They're wrong about who that is. I mean, in this case, it's basically old white liberal boomers. That's who keeps it limping along. And of course, those people aren't going to be around forever. And then you're going to see the real problem. Because what is happening in terms of race and identity in Canada? Now, Canada was 90 or 91% white in like 1981. It's not that long ago. Now it's just 60%. 60% white. This is one generation. It'll be majority non-white by 2041. And that understates it because most of the whites are going to be older. So you're basically unmaking the country within a single generation unless you get remigration. And naturally, this is accompanied by cultural changes. So who are these people moving in? Indians. So, for example, what's happening? Canada used to be known for its wilderness and outdoor life. Well, you don't have that anymore. Why? Because now the country's filled with Indians. And what do? They dump trash everywhere. So now you can't go camping anymore. And all these beautiful spaces have been destroyed. It happens in residential neighborhoods. This was from an Indian paper called Indian Express, complaining that people were noticing it and using it to report racism. There was a similar story from the Hindustan Times. The fact that I even have to know what the Hindustan Times is like a sign of decline. This was reported everywhere, though. Indians are dumping trash in the woods. This is what they do. And now even the rivers are filled with trash. Why? Partially because they just dump trash in the rivers. That's just what they do. But they also have religious ceremonies where they dump these idols in the rivers. But of course, their gods are literally just trash, just these like cheap little statues. So now the rivers are all clogged because they dumped all these statues in. I'm not making this up. Take a look. Now, India today bragged after the last elections that there are 22 Indians in the Canadian Parliament, up from 17 in the last one. Now, what's funny about this is you have these Sikh separatists who champion what they call Khalistan, who are anti-India. So now you get these pitched battles, street battles, but also political battles between Khalistanis or whatever you want to call them, or Sikhs, and Indians in the streets. It's the same as you have the Indians and the Pakistanis fighting in England. And sometimes it's pretty funny. So, for example, you have this clip. You have these Sikh separatists, I think they're in Vancouver or something, and they're telling in the Indians to go back to where you came from.
Indian skunk, we do not welcome you on land of Vancouver. We do not welcome you on land of freedom, land of Canada. Go back to your country. We just want to say.
I mean, maybe we've got another slogan, right? Everybody's a nativist against the immigrants they really don't like. The Indian government, of course, was publicly accused by Canada of being complicit in the assassination of one of these separatists on Canadian soil. They expelled each other's top diplomats in 2024. Like, traditionally, this is what you do before you go to war. And not surprisingly, I think the assassination may not have been on Canadian soil, but it was assassination of a Canadian citizen. And they expelled each other's diplomats. This was a huge diplomatic incident. This is what you do before you go to war. I mean, you expel the ambassador, then you invade, right? This is Canada. And like, they're at war with India. But when you import these people, you import their issues, you import their conflicts, you import their hatreds. And not surprisingly, these foreigners maintain close ties with the real country. Now, this just happened. Here are 3 Canadian politicians visiting the Punjab so they can pal around with the rifle-toting co-ethnics. This is something that would not be allowed in Canada. Take a look.
दयाले करनी कीरतो कर्म समाने एक शब्द एक भिक्षा मांगे ज्ञान ध्यान जुगत सच जागे रच रहे ना बाहर जाए कीमत कौन हृदय बनाए आपे मिले परम चुकाए गुर प्रसाद परम पद पाए गुर की संजाने रिधि मुरारी
ਚੱਲਦੀ ਪਈ ਆ ਅੱਜ ਹੁਣ ਆਪਣੇ ਕੋਲ ਲਗਭਗ 110-15
Now I know what you're thinking. Like, oh, look at these leftists and the liberals. Can you believe that they're doing this? No, these are the conservatives. This is the right wing. This is the Conservative Party. Like, these are the Tories. What are they conserving? Culturally, Canada is disintegrating. And you think, how can this be? They weren't stupid enough to import blacks. They still don't have a huge black population. Is it just Indians? No. They do have Indians, feather not dot. Now they have both, but the feather ones, they call them First Nations. And now, like in Australia, you have this sort of alternative national identity where the real Canadians are the First Nations. And the Anglos and the French who actually built the country, they're just written out of the national story. And there's almost a kind of jealousy because Canada didn't have slavery, there's no Holocaust, there's no colonial empire, and it's almost like they want one. So what have they done? They've created this myth about so-called residential schools. Now, what are those? These are basically the schools where Indian kids were sent to basically learn modern civilization. Now, of course, at the time, this was the progressive things to do. You might even call it desegregation. They're just like us. They can be Canadian too. I mean, are we supposed to say, like, no, they're too primitive, we can't teach them in these things? But now, it's cultural genocide. The arguments don't matter. It's just a question of what they can be used for. And now you've got a grievance. Now you've got something you can use to demand money and political power. So now it's genocide. So in schools, in Canadian schools, the white kids are taught basically the soft version, that these Indians were prevented from celebrating their culture. So, for example, this is the guilt indoctrination that they use in a Canadian school. Like, oh, look at, there's a literal frowny face. Do you see like how the Indians were sad? They couldn't celebrate their culture. This is the worst thing ever. Now, again, you don't get to have a culture. You have feelings about not being able to be part of a national community? Well, that doesn't matter. In fact, even having those feelings means you're a bad person. If you express these sorts of things in the exact same terms, you're a fascist. But we need to scream at your kids about what the Indians feel. And this is the soft version. The harder version, this narrative that I'm sure a lot of the college kids buy because you're seeing them agitate and you're even seeing these church burnings and everything else. The harder narrative is that these weren't just schools. They were basically something akin to death camps. That these kids were basically being killed there for no reason, either deliberately or out of neglect, and that you had these almost like mass graves. Now, of course, there's no evidence for any of this. They haven't found any. The New York Post reported on this years ago. There's this conservative libertarian think tank type thing called the Fraser Institute, had the same report a while back. There's no evidence for any of this, but it doesn't matter. It does not matter. They're now pushing to outlaw residential school denialism, like Holocaust denialism. because it's a political myth that's useful. Even if you concede everything that they say, let's say we buy the whole narrative. Okay, but participation in these schools was voluntary. No one was actually killing the kids on purpose or something. I mean, nobody's really making that kind of claim. It's basically that these kids were just dying and being buried somewhere and nobody was being told. It was never mandatory. It wasn't like concentration camps or something. So even if you take like the worst realistic reading of all of this, that some kids went to schools and maybe they didn't have a great time there, this is pretty thin stuff. This is not slavery. This is not the Holocaust. This is not ethnic cleansing. Even if you adopt the worst case scenario, which has already fallen apart, this isn't much. And yet, this is now the biggest thing. This is what Canadian history is about. This exploitation, this cultural genocide. And, mysteriously, there's been all these church fires since this hysteria began. Because who ran a lot of these residential schools? The Catholic Church. So, what do people do? They target the Catholic churches. Now, of course, the priests and the Pope won't say anything. No, they don't care, of course. But you do see Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he commented on it years ago. He denounced it. He said, you shouldn't burn down churches. But he also said this, quote, "One of my reflections is I understand the anger that's out there against the federal government, against institutions like the Catholic Church. It is real, and it is fully understandable given the shameful history that we are all becoming more and more aware of and engaging ourselves to do better as Canadians." Did any of this even happen? It doesn't matter. They want to believe it. Why? Because it gives you a weapon, if you're in the political class, that you can use against actual Canadians, whites, the Anglos and the French who actually built the country. Because now you can say they're colonialists, they're imperialists, they committed atrocities, you can get in on the fun games that we play in America with reparations and everything else, and that's why you have to give everybody else your stuff. At the World Series, for example, the singer changed the lyrics of "O Canada," so now it becomes "Our home on native land."
Oh Canada, our home on native land.
I mean, it's not just cringe. The guy can't even sing, but proves the point, right? I mean, everybody is a blood and soil nationalist for someone. And even the things that Canada used to brag about just no longer apply. Like, oh, look at our free healthcare. Yeah, may you receive Canadian healthcare? That's another way of telling someone to kill themselves. There's more MRI machines in Pennsylvania alone than all of Canada. The waiting lists are out of control. You have case after case of euthanasia being given to people who like felt depressed or like never gave consent. I mean, this is a nightmare, and none of this is surprising. By rights, Canada should be a proud country. It's got an insanely good military tradition. On paper, it has a system of government that like a right-winger would come up with. You would think it would keep it on the right, but once it's subverted, there's seemingly no way to break it. Hey guys, quick reminder before we continue. You can follow Identity Politics on Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, X, and TikTok. And if you want to make sure you never miss an episode, sign up for our email list. If you believe in this work and you want to help us stay fully independent, you can support us directly on Ko-Fi. We offer bronze, silver, gold, and white membership tiers, or you can give a one-time contribution, whatever works for you. Every bit of support helps fund production, research, and our ability to speak freely without corporate or platform pressure. All the links are in the description below. Now back to the show. But I do have some good news. There is resistance. Now, Fortissax is one of the more prolific posters in the Canadian nationalist movement. You may see him on X. I think he's going to be speaking at one of the conferences that a new group called the Dominion Society is going to be hosting soon. And this is a group that the Canadian media is beginning to track and to dread as anti-immigration sentiment rises in the Great White North, as with everywhere else. He joins us now. Check it out. My guest today is Fortissax from the Great White North, which is, as we've been talking about today, a troubled country these days. But there are patriots there who are trying to bring it back. I gotta say, man, Canada has, in many ways, from somebody on the right, its history is actually better than ours in terms of this is how you would want a society to be organized. You would expect it to come out a certain way. And yet, ever since the first Trudeau, it just seems to be on a path of deliberate national annihilation in a way that's so much worse than anything that's happened in the United States. What has happened to Canada?
Well,
Big question, I know.
Yeah, no, it's almost hard to put into words in such a short blurb. But what I would say is that, Canada went through one of the most pervasive cultural revolutions post the Second World War, in a way that I would almost compare to communist China, in that, this country experienced a top-down, deeply unpopular, forced rebranding, forced attempted erasure of the 400 years that existed prior. This kind of British-French settler colonial history that defined us for so much time, defines our culture, defines our institutions, just our folkways, even our cuisine, right?
Right.
And it's all in line with the post-war consensus, very much the same way that you see all around the world. We think of Pierre Trudeau as the initiator, as the originator of where all of this started to happen. But in truth, it goes back a little bit before him. He was just the executor. He's just the one who pulled the trigger. But there were forces manifesting as soon as the Second World War ended. They just didn't have their way until the 70s.
Well, how was it able to be done? Because, there are two separate things here. Reading a lot about Canadian history and about how traditionalist the society was in many respects. You had basically the Orange Order as like a dominant force in English Canadian cultural life, political life for a long time. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. And then Quebec, people used to talk about Quebec like it was basically France if the revolution never hit. This was like the old France, the royalist France. And then you had the Quiet Revolution, which in many ways, I think, explains our entire era. Within a remarkably short time, you have this highly religious, Catholic, traditionalist society becoming arguably the most left-wing part of a left-wing country. And all of this happened seemingly overnight.
Absolutely. Some people have compared it to the secularization of Ireland. I think that comparison is quite apt because it follows almost to a T the exact same kind of process. You have this deeply traditionalist, deeply Catholic society, very pro-natalist, very high birth rate. French Canada had the highest birth rate in the Western world for 200 years, with an average of 5 to 10 children per family. Deeply God-fearing, deeply religious people. And you're right to say that they were almost like a crystallization of northwestern France in the 17th century. Quebec was that. Quebec prided itself on that. And counter to the Orange Orders in Ontario, the sort of deeply pro-empire, deeply Protestant, group of traditionalists, you also had all sorts of Jesuit orders. You had all sorts of Catholic orders in Quebec. And they were also this. You have French-Canadian ethnic nationalism in the 19th century, and that was modeled very similarly to national action in France. Very fascinating stuff. Things that you wouldn't expect, things that most Canadians don't know, and perhaps what most Americans would have no idea ever occurred up here.
So was it just a question of, because reading about the Quiet Revolution in Quebec and then what happened more broadly, this sounds overly simplistic, but if there's one thing I've learned doing this for a long time, it's that a lot of things really aren't that complicated. They're actually quite simple. Is it really just a question of, we'll start with Quebec. They just took education away from the Catholic Church and put it into the hands of the government, and then it was just that simple? Just overnight you got a cultural revolution? Because when you try to explain how did this happen, that seems to be the big policy thing that did it.
So the Quiet Revolution is a bit of a complex topic because in one way it mirrors the profound cultural changes that you see across the Western world. But in a more mechanical way, you see the emergence of a second managerial state. After World War II, Ottawa's wartime infrastructure was converted for civilian purposes. As James Burnham, someone I'm a big fan of, Samuel Francis, they would say that, these around the Second World War is when these sort of all consolidating, concentrating power centers were being built. Well, C.D. Howe built this in Ottawa, sort of depriving the old elites of Anglo-Canada of their political power and influence. And in order to counter this, a movement also occurred in Quebec that would build effectively a French-Canadian managerial ethno-state to counter this sort of growing influence. So there were a lot of actors involved in the Quiet Revolution. One of and of course, the most prominent faction were the communists.
Right.
Their rhetoric for French Canadian nationalists, for Quebec separatists today, is really what permeates, is really what won out in the end. But it really was this kind of mix of right-wing technocrats, communists, social democrats. Quebec today will tell you that their core values are the French language, social democracy, and secularism. Right. So it was this kind of coalescence of these ideas. But in the end, Cthulhu always swims left, and and the managerial state that was built to protect the French Canadian ethnos has become this thing very much in line with Anglo-Canada.
But they regard Anglo-Canada almost as like a colonial master, and this seems to be what happened to Anglo-Canada seems to be somehow worse than just buckling under to the demands of the Quebecois, because they've done that, but then at the same time, they've almost like accepted the critique that they are the colonial master, and so therefore they have to deconstruct themselves as well. I mean, the self-hatred in Anglo-Canada, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be more severe than anything you see in Quebec.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, it is. And it is because they were the cultural and political hegemon. More recently, you see attempts at fabricating a Holocaust-like myth in Canada with the residential schools and the First Nation stuff.
And I'm going to say it because I don't want you to go to jail. Like, it's all bullshit. Like, it's all bullshit.
Oh, yeah,
it never happened.
Anyone.
Well, don't you say it. I don't want you to get like kidnapped in the middle of the night here.
I'll get black bagged by Carney CSC.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, but it's almost like they looked at, because there's this not funny, but kind of dated movie that Michael Moore, of all people, made, Canadian Bacon.
I already know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and he's like, oh, how did they get away without no black people? And they're like, no slavery. Like, damn, they're smart. And it's like, it's almost like they're looking at the original sin of slavery, which is what everybody says in the United States, and saying, man, how could we have missed out on that? So we have to invent one now. Like, they actually want the guilt. They actually want the crippling moral paralysis.
So the subversion of Anglo-Canadian identity really goes back to an intellectual by the name of J.M. Bumstead. And J.M. Bumstead was a Fabian socialist, and he was one of the first people to chronicle Canadian history, to revise it as this kind of cultural mosaic. So Ricardo Duchesne talks about this in Canada in Decay, which is one of the most important books for a Canadian nationalist to read, because it actually goes in depth of our demographic history as well as the ethnic makeup of the country from beginning to end, or from beginning to modernity. So J.M. Bumstead, revised Canadian history to say, well, technically we were 92% British and French in 1867, but also there were the black loyalists. I know half of them. There was only about a couple thousand, and half of them went back to Sierra Leone. But and they only settled in Nova Scotia and nowhere else, and have no influence in the country. But look at how diverse we were. And there were Germans who came with the loyalists too. And then there were Hessian Jaegers. And then look, there's the Ukrainians. And we're such a diverse mosaic. So he was really one of the first people to kind of plant the seeds of this idea. And then in the 40s, you have politicians like Jack Pickersgill. Jack Pickersgill coined the term, Canada is a nation of immigrants. And so Prime Minister...
that far back.
Exactly. And Prime Minister Mackenzie King in the 40s, despite his open anti-immigration and probably sincere anti-immigration attitude, was being pressured by international forces at the time. He was being pressured by the United Nations to accept wartime refugees of all stripes, mostly from Eastern Europe. And so, the chipping away began there. And then we have Lester Pearson. Everyone talks about Pierre Trudeau, but Lester Pearson was his predecessor. Lester Pearson is the one who changed the flag. Lester Pearson is the one who opposed South Africa. Lester Pearson opened the doors.
Out of the Commonwealth, right?
Right. And in 1967, just like the United States, Canada mimicked the Hart-Scheller kind of situation. And so the immigration went from favoring British and French immigrants to Eastern and Southern Europe, and then to the rest of the world, the developing world. Right. And so it's a really long line of this occurring. You have liberal intellectuals like Will Kimlicka, who created the sort of intellectual fabric of the Charter and Rights and Freedoms, this kind of legal document that privileges minority groups at the expense of the majority. And it's enshrined into law. It's the liberal sacred document, this Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, all of these kind of forces, Nanette Kelly in the year 2000 writing A Making of a Mosaic, this book that yet again fabricates this history of us as being super diverse. But here's the thing, right? Like, Canada has such a short history with mass immigration from the developing world, to the point where it's like Ireland. Like Ireland, for example, only started to receive people in the 1980s, 1990s. So it's even later than the United States. Like maybe the doors were open in 67, but the demographics didn't start changing until the 80s and the 90s. So there's really no precedent. And yet the message from the state is we were always a nation.
We've always been this way.
Yeah.
Right.
We've always been this way. It's very, we were always at war with East Asia.
And you can kind of say that about the United States, although obviously a lot of this immigration was white, and that does make a difference. But with Canada, with Ireland, I mean, it was never like that. There was no wave of like mass Irish and Italian immigration to Canada or something in like the late 19th century. This just isn't a thing.
No. And we didn't have an Ellis Island moment. Part of that is because Canada is about 100 years younger, or at least the current rendition of the state. So we skipped the Ellis Island thing. The other thing is that Canadian authorities were much more selective with their settlement patterns. There were three principal waves of immigration or settlership to Canada in the 19th century. The first was 800,000 Irishmen, mostly leaving because of the potato famines. And they were the first sort of crop in the 19th century. After them, you have the Scots. And the Scots came after the Scottish land clearances in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, about 200 to 300,000 Scots after the 800,000 Irish. And then the last massive wave of settlers to Canada were 1.9 Englishmen who were dispossessed from the Industrial Revolution, usually craftsmen, artisans, shipbuilders, cabinet makers, these sort of middle class, lower middle class types of workers who all sort of came mostly to Toronto, Halifax, and Montreal. And what's fascinating is that all of these groups assimilated to a pre-existing Anglo-Canadian culture. Right. That went back. So we think of these immigration waves, these settlement waves, as having been further Britishizing the country. But it was actually the other way around. They were being Canadianized. There was already a distinct Anglo-Canadian ethos in Anglo-Canada.
And this is something that I think a lot of Americans don't really understand, partially because at this point we're basically familiar with, let's face it, the Canada of the Leaf as opposed to Canada of the Red Ensign. So this is kind of one of the problems, is that Canadians basically were the shock troopers of the British Empire in World War I. I mean, they were by far the troops that the Germans feared the most. And let's face it, even though I don't like to admit this, I mean, you basically beat us twice. I mean, we invaded twice, we tried to take you over twice, and we lost both times. So and we're the only country that's ever really done that. And yet, at this point, people will talk about Canada, and they're like, they're just a bunch of pushovers and everything else. And it's like, it's almost like Canadian leaders after the 1960s accepted what you're saying, that there was this distinct Anglo-Canadian ethos and this military tradition, which is highly admirable, and said, and that's why we need to destroy it. Why did they get rid of the Red Ensign? Why did they decide we need to have a totally different identity from being part of the empire? It being like arguably the most militaristic and traditionalist part of the empire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you nailed it. You hit the nail right on the head, right? And it's because, well, the flag, specifically the flag. So the flag debate kicked off in the 1960s by Lester Pearson, liberal leader Lester Pearson. Pearson was a very hardcore liberal Democrat. The FBI actually had a dossier on him, suspecting him of being a Soviet spy because it suspected that he was communing with communists while associating with liberal Democrats in the United States at the time. Although no proof was ever uncovered of it. There's, where there's smoke, there is fire. And so he was a staunch anti-colonialist. And they didn't like the red ensign because on the red ensign, and you'll see this on my header on my X profile, is the arms of Canada. Right. They didn't like it because the arms of Canada implied that there was a certain ethnic and racial exclusivity to the country. And that ethnic exclusivity was British and French. It wasn't inclusive enough. It wasn't liberal enough.
Right.
So that's why they got rid of it. The flag change kicks off. John Diefenbaker makes who was then the prime minister, makes a very, very strong last stand. The majority of Canadians did not support the flag change. And in the video, and I've posted this before on X, the crowd is booing Pearson when he says a flag centered around the maple leaf to symbolize the beginning of the new Canada. And the crowd goes wild, angry, booing, cursing, screaming at that this person would dare to change the sacred symbol of our nation. And in my view, it really is our true flag. Now, the Union Jack, that's the other reason. He actually tried to backstab the British during their overseas operations. He didn't approve of the Suez Crisis in 1956, 1957. And so he was just a left liberal utopian. He was a left liberal, post-war consensus kind of globalist in this view. And you're right. And that's why they had to neuter the Canadian spirit, because we do have a very robust military tradition. We did inspire the German Sturmtruppen in the First World War. It was Canadian shock troops that were the inspiration for that platform, or that program in the German military. Right. And then in World War II, we were the only non-British or American force to have our own beachhead at Normandy. Right. We advanced double. We advanced double the distance, and we're the only group to complete all of our objectives in the landing of Juno Beach. So, it was just too high test. They had to get rid of it. They had to, you should hear, honestly, Canadian atrocities in both of these wars are pretty crazy stuff. Like there's a joke online like that we invented half of the Geneva Convention. Now that's not exactly true, but there is
at least a quarter of it though.
Exactly, right? So there is some truth to it.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that seems so foreign now, and it's almost like the stereotypes that people talk about Canada were just an apology for this. Like, oh, well, they're just nice, and they're just apologetic, and we're just like, none of this comes from Canadian history at all. And it sounds like there should be something more complicated to it, that there was a deliberate plot, that there was being subverted because there was some evil scheme or whatever else. But then when you read the rhetoric of post-war Canadian leaders, and you compare it, frankly, to some of the people that you have in the United States and Britain, it's almost like the lesson they took away from World War II was just nobody should ever have a national identity again. And so if we basically neuter ourselves, if we jettison our own identity, somehow, some way, in some form that we haven't really thought about, we just end up with one world and everybody gets along. And it's no more complicated than that. That sounds too simplistic, but that seems to be what they really believed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would argue that it's even more pervasive in Canada because the crux of, we call them leaf libs here in Canada. The online right, the dissident right in Canada refer to these folks as leaf libs. So the leaf lib ethos is it's almost like they're trying to outdo blue Americans. It's almost like they've turned that reflexive anti-Americanism, which used to be rooted in something tangible and real historical grievances, and they've converted it into outdoing the Ellis Island mythology. We have to be more progressive than the Americans. The LGBT flag, that's not good enough. We're 2S LGBTQIA, and so they invented the Progress Pride flag. And this Pierre Trudeau tried to copy that Ellis Island mythology. The whole thing in 1971 was the culture mosaic. We don't assimilate immigrants. We're a mosaic. We leave them be. We have this patchwork, this tapestry of ethnic enclaves who don't interact each other unless they speak English for transactional purposes. They don't assimilate, they don't integrate, they don't communicate. There's no community cohesion. But this is better than assimilation because we're not like those Americans, right?
Yeah, this is one of the weird things, is that the nationalism, the anti-nationalism is justified on pseudo-nationalist grounds of this is how we prevent being assimilated or conquered by the Americans. I mean, is that too much of a overstatement? I mean, because that seems to be what it's about.
That's part of it. I would say that's kind of part of it. I don't know if the cultural mosaic model was specifically for the defense, but it was definitely in contravention to what was then viewed as American policy, which is funny because they're left liberals, and the assimilationists in the United States were just right liberals.
Yeah,
it's
just all part of the same.
It's just liberalism on liberalism. That's all it was.
Right. Well, let's talk about what happened with the second Trudeau, because this is where you really see Canada as a nation essentially disintegrating as far as like a national identity goes. And I don't want to say I'm picking on Canada here. It's not like any of us are doing all that well, frankly. I mean, people want to say, oh, look at how the Indians have taken over Canada. It's like, have you seen Texas lately? I mean, we're not doing much better. Big, tough Texas, same problem.
Right.
But it does seem that with the second Trudeau, it really does mark a point where they really kicked all this into overdrive. Massive Indian immigration, the idea of self-loathing is almost a defining national trait. As you say, building up this residential schools thing is almost like a Holocaust or slavery equivalent. So you have something you can feel guilty about. And yet behind it all also, and this is how we distinguish ourselves from the United States somehow. Like what exactly is driving this guy? And I mean, I suppose I should ask the obvious question. Is it even Trudeau's kid?
So I'll comment on that because this is funny. I'm one of the few people who actually do believe who actually does believe that he is Pierre Trudeau's son. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't change the fact that Pierre Trudeau was a swinger. There's all kinds of weird lore associated with that family. Pierre Trudeau was a Marxist-Leninist. He was just forced to cover it up in liberal democracy, kind of pretend to be a liberal Democrat. And if you look at younger photos of Pierre Trudeau, he does look like Justin, but it is odd because, Castro kind of does look like them too.
Yeah,
superficially.
Yeah. I never really bought the rumor, but then I saw the pictures and I was like, no,
there's something to it. It's possible. I won't say it's impossible. It is possible. But yeah, so there's a couple of principal groups in Canada who are orchestrating this. And for a very long time, the goal for many Canadian elites was to grow our population. And this ties into the very, very early subversion attempts. We had been succeeding first with very high birth rates, both in French Canada and in Anglo Canada. But post-war, the authorities were not satisfied with the speed of which we were growing our population. And so the idea of 100 million people by the year 2100 was born. There is a group called the Century Initiative who want to grow Canada's population to 100 million by 2100. And before Trudeau's waves of immigration, the population was about 36 million. The population is now approaching 44 million. It will probably be 46 or 47. And 95% of that population growth is from immigrants. It's not the children of immigrants. It's not ethnic Canadians. It is just straight up arrivals. And so the GDP actually hasn't, the argument they had put forward to everybody for years, and it's completely collapsed, and you almost don't even see them justifying this anymore.
Right.
So the Bank of Canada releases a report in the year of 2025 or 2024 saying that from 2015 to 2025, we consider this an economic lost decade because the GDP has not gone up.
Which was the decade of mass immigration.
Correct. So the GDP did not change, except now we have more inflation. Now we have a few 5 to 6 million extra people. Job growths did not go. Youth unemployment is at 24 or 25%. So you just don't see the justification for it anymore. But they're still hell-bent on reducing the country to a post-national economic zone where anyone from anywhere can do anything. And for what purpose? To make line go up. That is the purpose, at least for those aspects.
But is the line even going up?
No.
I mean, I guess that's the question. If the line's not going up, what is even the point at this point? Unless it's just spite against the historic Canadian population.
They were able to paste over the reality by using statistics saying that the raw GDP was increasing, but and then Canada entered a population trap, in which case the population is too big for the size of the economy, which means that the GDP starts to go down. because there's not enough goods and services and jobs to increase that, and it strains the whole system. So, they're trying to lower immigration. Mark Carney, surprisingly, is very quietly slashing numbers to more manageable levels. I think
I've noticed. Yeah, I think he knows.
Well, I mean, they kind of have no choice. Make no mistake, Mark Carney is one of them. He was the governor of the Bank of England, and then he was the governor of the Bank of Canada, and he transed his own kid who lives in the States. So, he is one of them, but I think he was brought in to be a manager to sort of control and cool down the situation. I don't think he's going to succeed.
Well, why hasn't there been, I mean, again, everybody can say, I'm not trying to dunk on it, but when you look at Europe, you've got all these nationalist parties springing up, and you've got a real resistance, even in Britain and in the UK, now with Restore Britain and everything else. I used to say UK was probably the country that was the most down bad, but that's not really true anymore. In some cases, the UK has more going on than the United States at this point. So you will about Trump, but with Trump and MAGA, you at least have a reaction. You've got something that's basically been dominating the political scene for a decade and has been doing a lot of stuff. But in Australia, even, you have got a party. But New Zealand and Canada seem to be the two countries where you don't have a nationalist party, even a soft nationalist party in government speaking out against this. And the Tories are, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, they make the British Conservatives look hardcore. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen.
Watching, it has been shocking. It has been genuinely shocking to see Mark Carney and the Liberals outflank them on even the most basic policies that the Conservatives could be putting forward, even in slashing immigration, removing the carbon tax, even throwing a bone, giving a nod to our British-French settler history, to the monarchy. I can't. You're telling me that Mark Carney is more of a Canadian nationalist in this sense than Pierre Poilievre. Now, there's a lot of. It's complicated. Part of it is because the CPC, the Conservative Party of Canada, is wholly ideologically captured by Pierre Trudeau's liberalism. You'll see Canadian nationalists point this out. Conservatives have conserved nothing. They haven't even conserved Pierre Trudeau's liberalism. And that is their idea of Canada. It is a post-national economic zone with better management. So the other problem is that the CPC has economic ties to red state America. And so they were caught in a quagmire because they benefit the most. They're focused in Western Canada. Conservative Party headquarters, if I'm not mistaken, is in Calgary, in Alberta. So they benefit. They require trade with their immediately southern state neighbors. And so they were caught in the quagmire. They were caught in the Liberals beat them in LARPing as Canadian patriots. And so they couldn't, and so they were accused of being pro-annexationist. And they just couldn't conjure up an appropriate response, a response that, I think the appropriate response, even if performative to the whole annexation threats, are what the French far right are doing, which is, okay, well, we need a stronger military. We need to buck liberalism, redirecting all of that anger towards the reigning local liberals and not so much towards MAGA. Now, I'm guilty myself of having been caught in that quagmire. I think we all have, when it comes to Canadian annexation. But I think that John Carter,
I do occasionally, offer the army to be sent
I saw that yesterday. I was like,
their morale is broken. Let's get them.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is an obvious point here, though. I mean, because we all, how to put this? Go ahead.
To answer your question, though, is as to why a response hasn't occurred yet. So the first thing is that we have a saying in Canada, which is that we have 1/10 the population size. We have 1/10 the economic size of the United States. And we're 10 years politically behind the United States. And the other problem is that Canada has a very centralized media apparatus.
Right.
Very, very centralized media apparatus, perhaps more so than the United Kingdom and France. Canada is also sparsely populated, and it's very big. It's a big country, but it's a small nation. And so information travels slowly. Just now, things are changing, obviously, because X is the most utilized app for news in all of Canada, as it is in most countries. But you are seeing the rumblings. There was first the People's Party of Canada, which failed, but it did stand up for Canadians during the lockdowns and the Freedom Convoy. They were the only mainstream sort of political party that was actively trying to take a stand for Canadians, representing some form of Canadian nationalism. But they fell flat because in many ways they're very much like Reform, or they're very much like, Front National, or I guess RN, or whatever they're called now in France. They had a very libertarian ethos, a very classical liberal kind of limited government constitutionalist ethos. And the problem is that Canadians are not liberals.
No.
They're very illiberal people. We actually, like, strong government is one of our founding principles. Centralization of power, strong central government, state capitalism, crown corporations, government-owned corporations. We've always been that way because that is pre-liberal conservatism.
Right.
Which
you would think that would keep it on the right, but it's almost like once you have this elite takeover, it makes it almost impossible to break it away from the left. Like it's like a very fortified conservatism of leftism, if that makes sense.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly how I would frame it. And so, with the rise of, like, Dominion Society is kind of like the premier sort of nationalist group that has forced the national conversation on remigration very recently. My colleague Daniel Tyree started that with his colleague Greg Wycliffe. The Remigration Society already has over 2,000 members. You have men's clubs like the Second Sons, and you have all of these other sort of independent, sort of regionalist, nationalist groups, and all of the Canadian nationalist content creators, influencers, public figures are sort of coalescing organically now, putting pressure on the system. People, and I'm sure you've known this, you've been in the game for a very long time. A lot of people, even if they are nationalists, don't necessarily get along. They have divergent, they have divergent views, even among their colleagues, even if they have shared ideas, even if they want to see the same thing, and a posterity for their people, right? Guaranteeing that posterity.
Right.
And, but what you're seeing is this organic convergence of all these people, combined messaging. I think a great example of this was Flag Day. You saw that, the massive ratioing. Yeah. The massive ratioing of government accounts, the Prime Minister of Canada, the House of Commons, and the Canadian Senate, talking about the beauty of the maple leaf flag, and all you see in the comments is thousands of Reddits, right? So there is something happening here. We have former premiers, like the former premier of Alberta, quote tweeting Daniel Tyree and explaining why, finger wagging and tone policing, why remigration is bad, and comparing it to the Ukrainians who went to the prairie provinces. You have Erin O'Toole, the former leader of the Conservative Party, trying to debate Edmund Burke for some reason with our guys. So they are paying attention. And as of today, Pierre Poilievre dropped this video about we're gonna slash deluxe benefits for immigrants, and I'm just like,
too little, too late.
Well, it's exactly. It's one, it's too little, too late. Two, they're being pulled in our direction because they know if they don't nip this in the bud, there will be a nationalist alternative, the likes of Restore Britain, pretty soon. I see that. I foresee that within the next 5 years, easy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as we've seen with Reform, I've seen Nigel Farage out there saying, I'm the greatest opponent of the far right and everything else. I mean, the containment operation has failed, and now you have a real alternative, and it's not hard to imagine that could happen in Canada.
Absolutely.
But I want to close, when we get to the end, I want to talk more about Dominion Society, Second Sons, all these groups and your efforts. But before we get into that, I do want to talk about the annexation and the separatism questions, because the way I think about these things, just to lay my cards on the table, is pretty pragmatic in the sense that if you asked me, what do I think about, say, Flemish independence in Europe, I'd be like, I'm in favor of it. And they'd be like, why? And it's like, because it would be a right-wing country, and it would break up Belgium, and it would be something that would strengthen the right and the kinds of racial and political causes that I believe in. But if you said like Catalan separatism or Basque separatism in Spain, I'd be like, I'm totally against it. And why? Because those are like left-wing nationalisms, and I want those people to be crushed. I want Spain to be united because I want it to be on the right, and I want the Spanish people to be preferred and everything else. The question with Canada is very similar to the question of secession in the United States. When we're not in control of the federal government, things like the South seceding again, or Texas independence, or Idaho and all these other places, these sorts of things get talked up on the right, and I see the value in it. But of course, what we really want, I think if we all had things the way we'd want, is we'd want our own country to be strong and united and preferably growing. The question becomes with something like Canada, where you have this sort of permanent left-wing establishment, almost like a dictatorship in a way that seems much harder to unseat than what we have in the States. What exactly is the reason not to want to break away from it? And more than that, why not throw in with us? I mean, at least with Alberta.
So there are issues with the separatist movements. The two prominent separatist movements in Canada are typically Alberta and Quebec. Quebec has a very long precedent, Quebec separatists, going back to the Quiet Revolution. And in my view, they have more of a legitimate claim to secession because they are a nation. French Canadians are a distinct ethnicity. You know, they have a distinct language. Nominally, they do have a distinct culture. The problem with Quebec separatists is that the vast majority of them are of the leftist stripe.
Right.
They are of the Sinn Féin and Catalonian and Basque separatist stripe.
Right.
You know, the SNP, actually, I compare them to the Scottish SNP. You know, they will tell you, they'll say, well, we're the original Canadians. And if you ask them, are you Canadian? They're like, no, I'm Quebecois. Okay, well, which is it, right? They do the same thing that the First Nations do in Canada, the separatists, which is like, we're the original Canadians. Are you Canadian? No, I'm Iroquois, or I'm Cree, or I'm, you know, Blackfoot, or whatever. So there's that problem. The problem is an independent Quebec might destroy itself even faster, to be honest with you, because they might just open the floodgates to the entire francophonie, to the entire French-speaking world. Because as long as you speak French, you're French Canadian, you're Quebecois. And that is the crux of their understanding of Quebec identity. They've reduced their identity to language. And, you know, this worked back when the country was 97% European. Right. Because every French speaker was a French Canadian. That doesn't work so much anymore when you have Congolese and Algerians and Moroccans and Lebanese people, Vietnamese people, and increasingly Hispanics, I guess, which has been quite surprising.
But isn't there a reaction about that? I don't mean to interrupt, but there's this famous quote from when the Quebec independence referendum failed by a small amount. And one of the leaders said, we failed because of money and the ethnic vote.
Correct.
I mean, at this point, it's pretty clear that when you import these immigrants, even if they're Francophone immigrants, they vote for unity because that's where they get their welfare from.
That's right. And that's exactly the problem. It's the reason why I don't think the referendum planned by the Parti Québécois in October is going to, or sorry, if they win and then the succeeding referendum they want to put through is not going to succeed. If money and the ethnic vote stopped the independence referendum in 95, it's not going to happen now. Like Montreal has been flooded with so many different foreigners who will vote for the Liberal Party, who do vote for Liberal, or they vote for Québec Solidaire, or they vote for any of these other groups. Now, moving on to Alberta independence. The problem with Alberta independence is that Albertans don't see themselves as a nation. Albertans are Anglo-Canadians. They're Anglo-Canadians on the prairies, but they are Anglo-Canadians. And maybe they are a little bit more Americanized. They have a little bit more of a recent settler history, a recent frontier history. And so that they cherish that memory. They cherish the lifestyle of ranching. They're a resource economy. They've got oil and gas. Right. You know, they're very much, people say they're like the Texas North. I think that's a little bit exaggerated. They're more like Montana or Idaho. Right. You know, but the problem is that their grievances with the federal government are almost exclusively economic. An Albertan separatist will tell you that they will accept immigration from anywhere as long as they assimilate to their values. They are, at best, civic nationalists. And ultimately, you know, any province separating puts the entirety of Canada in jeopardy. The reason we confederated in 1867 was to protect our sovereignty. You know, provinces getting picked off threatens the integrity of all of Canada. It threatens our distinct ethnos. It threatens our institutions. It threatens our way of life. And we do have a distinct culture. And we don't want to see that lost. So, I mean, I'm a federalist. That's my view. But yeah, so that's the problem, right? It's like, or even British Columbian independence. Does an independent BC want to get caught in the crossfire between a Cold War between China and the United States? Does it want to be the Belgium of that kind of situation? I don't think so. And, you know, half the population of Alberta is already foreign anyway. So for the same reason that the separatism is not going to succeed in Quebec is the same reason it won't succeed in Alberta. And the last thing I'll say about these separatist movements is that it's all old people. It's all silver hairs. You look at any photo or video of Alberta separatism, you'll see nothing but Canadian boomers. You go to Quebec separate, you'll see nothing but old folks and immigrants, francophone immigrants. So these are not authentic movements anymore. They are sort of relics of the Cold War period of the 60s and 70s, when there was much more arguably to fight over than now. And the reason we're opposed to joining the United States is many Canadian nationalists will tell you, like, we're seeing what's going on down there. We're looking at Minneapolis. We're looking at the riots in California. We think that Gavin Newsom is your your Justin Trudeau, except that he's much more intelligent and much more cunning. We look at him like American Psycho. We think he is a very dangerous man. I look at your Democrats. I see what happens in Virginia with how the GOP is completely locked out. That's not, and of course, that doesn't even speak for the Zionism or for AIPAC or for any of these other orgs. Do we want to be dragged into that on top of our pre-existing?
On top of everything else,
exactly, right? On top of the residential school stuff, on top of the Indians, the Hinduva supremacists and the Khalistani separatists in our borders, the fights between the Russians and the Ukrainians, the Chinese and the Hong Kongers, or the Taiwanese. Do we want to get caught in that crossfire? I don't think so. Best case scenario, the way most Canadian nationalists are looking at integration with the U.S. is maybe we get cheaper gas and groceries at Costco for 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and then it's just economic stuff.
But then, you know what I mean? But then everything just goes to crap anyway. So what's the point of trading our national our nominal sovereignty for short-term economic gain? And to be fair to those folks, I understand why, right? Everybody in this country is hurting. Canada produces less than Alabama at this point. So, everyone is very desperate for short-term relief. But it is up to us as nationalists to provide that beacon of hope that things can change and that we can provide an alternate future for Canadians. That doesn't involve being poor and broke and suffocating under this tone policing HR culture, right? This open discrimination of the state against Canadians. The CBC openly says white men need not apply in their job applications. Many big corporations have diversity, equity, and inclusivity mandates. They will put foreigners above Canadians. So I get it. I understand all of the economic arguments, but ultimately, we as nationalists do not believe that integration will really serve the long-term goal or the posterity of Canadians in the long term.
I want to give you an opportunity to talk about that alternative that you're creating, but there is something that has been thinking about for a long time. Again, cards on the table, this is American Renaissance. Fundamentally, I'm not interested so much in the United States of America. I'm interested in whites. And when I look at white Americans, I look at white Canadians, I look at white French, I look at white British. At the end of the day, I have way more in common with Europeans or white Canadians or anything else than I do with these Indians who are moving into Texas and calling themselves Texans. And yet, and I think you even see this with the hockey game, and I have a point here. I'm not just trying to dunk again. When you look at like the hockey game yesterday or this weekend, it was like the last time you saw an old-fashioned national rivalry. Like it actually was a Canadian team and it actually was an American team. And so you could actually get invested in it because you had a stake in it. But if you look at like the USA basketball team, like these people are nothing to me and I'm nothing to them. And yet when we talk about things like sovereignty, we talk about things like national independence, and I understand that America is in some sense the superpower, but in another sense, white Americans are not sovereign even in our own country. I mean, forget being a superpower. We're not even really independent.
Right.
And neither are you, and neither is anybody else. So before we get into like building this alternative, and I understand we are where we are, we need to try to capture the states where we live. I mean, you need government power at some point. At some level, to even talk about these national rivalries or everything else, isn't it just kind of fake? Because they're coming after us because we're white, not because we're American or Canadian or British or whatever else.
Yeah, I think there's much to that. We do have a saying among the Canadian nationalists, which is, and it's part of this is because we didn't go through your Ellis Island situation. We didn't manage to consolidate a great many of these European folk into a nominal kind of American identity. But the saying that we have is an all-white economic zone is still an economic zone. And our relationship to recent European immigrants is very similar to how it is in Europe. I would say that this is a big principal difference between Canada and the States. The British have a hard time with Poles because the Poles kind of move to, for example, the Poles will move to Britain. They don't really assimilate. They don't integrate. They're not interested in British culture. Canada has a very similar relationship with a great many of these diasporas. And in Canada's case, like, we have a very long history of these extra European groups kind of working against the British and French ethnic majority, which is not to say that I don't support, American Renaissance or white nationalism. I understand.
It's a different situation.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a different situation. And the thing in Canada is that two things are happening at once. The first is that for the first time in 3 generations, Canadian identity is rearing its head. That's one, a distinctly Canadian identity. The second situation that is happening is that the entire Western world is demographically threatened. And so sometimes these things come into conflict here or even in our circles. Some prefer white identity over Canadian identity. They prefer the more global, civilizational kind of abstract to the local and the national. But that isn't to say that these two things are necessarily in conflict. They overlap, certainly. So I do agree with you. I think that in the end, like, most of these, like, when you look at Rupert Lowe talking about a deportation NATO, I think that cooperation between Western countries is going to happen anyway, between all of these distinct nationalist groups. I think that there will be. You already saw the beginnings of this with all the populist movements who were kind of coalescing around the spirit of MAGA 10-ish years ago. I think that trend is going to continue, where we see this sort of interconnectivity of different nationalist voices all across the world.
We'll talk about what your effort specifically is shaping up to be, because you guys got a conference coming up, correct?
We have many conferences coming up this year. Yeah. So my main goal has always been to instill a sense of mythic indigeneity to Canadians, to recapture this spirit of our identity, to educate and mythologize our history. Because as I'm sure you've noticed, there is no Canadian blockbuster called The Loyalist.
Yeah.
There is no story of Pierre Radisson, who was kidnapped at 18 and tortured and forced to live among the Iroquois for 2 years, escaping to Europe before coming back to Canada, and then eventually founding the Hudson's Bay Company. There is no story of Samuel de Champlain's, killing 2 Iroquois chiefs with a single shot of his musket on the shores of Lake Champlain. There is no Canadian heroic impetus. All of that has been brushed aside. All of that has been put away. The sacrifice of Isaac Brock, and dying in the battlefield against American soldiers. The Herculean efforts of Wolfe and Montcalm in the battles of the Plains of Abraham. Right. These two massive titans of Anglo and French Canada duking it out that would, pave the way for Canada, very much like Hector and Achilles. My goal has always been instilling that sense of indigeneity, that sense of rootedness that has been lost. And so all of my work is focused on that, and clearly defining a Canadian identity and putting that forward, reminding people who they are. That's what I'm focused on.
How do you see the Quebecois identity fitting into that rooted Canadian identity?
French Canadians, I've always believed, are a core and integral part of this nation. And there's a case to be made that we're two nations, but we are, in some senses, we are an empire. But the two core groups of the nation are Anglo and are British and French Canadians.
Right.
And for a very long time, like, separatists in particular will deny their own agency and their own influence. But the reality is that 7 of the fathers of Confederation were French Canadian. They even fought in the Patriot rebellions, one of them in particular. Canada would not exist if not for Georges Etienne Cartier, who worked with Sir John A. Macdonald to form this confederation. French Canadians, are represented on the arms of Canada, on the shield. They make up 22% of all whites among white people in Canada. So they are kind of this integral thing. Our relationship is very much like Wales and England. I would
Right,
say it's kind of like that, where it's like, yes, they, or like the way the British are sort of approaching their situation now, which is that, sure, it may be predominantly English dominated, but
the Scots, the Welsh, the English,
exactly,
the indigenous people, right?
Exactly, the Northern Irish, right? So that's kind of how we fit. That's kind of how we fit French Canadians. I view them. I mean, I myself, I'm an Anglo-Quebecer. We're descendants of the loyalists to Quebec and also of the Carignan Salières, the French soldiers who were sent to crush the Iroquois. So Anglo-Quebecers are this British-French group that have existed for a couple hundred years, that have intermarried for a very long time. So I'm very attuned. I'm very comfortable with both, the binational character of the country. And I think that a lot of the separatism would be curbed if the federal state simply just acted in favor of Canadian culture.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, because so much of the impetus for separation, especially in the 1977 Bill 101, which mandated that French become the sole official language of the province, and it saw a massive exodus of Anglo-Quebecers, 200,000, most of them to Toronto. Even this was an attempt at shielding French Canadian culture from English-speaking immigrants who were not Canadian, such as the Italians, the Greeks, Ukrainians, Russians, Portuguese, all these other groups that were coalescing in Montreal and then speaking English, usually because they believed they'd have better economic success in North America. It was, bigger access to markets, bigger job opportunities, and so forth.
Right.
But they did antagonize on a local level French Canadian culture and identity. They always tend to vote liberal, as opposed to for any sign of Canadian nationalism. So if the federal state literally just respected Canadian identity, if it had a sensible immigration policy that was predominantly Western, focused on British and French identity, Commonwealth immigrants from France, perhaps the United States, the rest of the Western world, with a very strong integration policy and the social infrastructure to accommodate that, I could see the separatist movements dying down because all of their concerns would be addressed pretty much.
Where do you see the historic Canadian identity? Because obviously it's inseparable from the legacy of Britain, and obviously the head of state remains His Majesty the King. That is who is on the currency. That is who technically is sovereign. But obviously you've got this, you see this in Australia and New Zealand too, where it's almost like there's a counterfeit nationalism where we need to have a nationalism separate from Britain. And so what we have to turn to are the non-white indigenous peoples, because this is the authentic tradition of the people. So you see some Canadians turning to, we'll just use the American term, turning to the Indians. And you see the same thing with the Abos in Australia and everything else, because this is how we show we're not just a British transplant, because that's somehow illegitimate or not authentic nationalism. But to me, it seems like the non-American Anglo world has sort of lost its identity with the loss of the empire. And this includes even the United Kingdom itself, where you have strong separatist tensions. And of course, to be clear, why did the British Empire collapse? We don't need to get into it here, but as I told you in the message, a lot of that is frankly our fault.
FDR.
America, FDR was hated the British Empire. This idea that FDR and Churchill were buddies is ridiculous. If FDR treated Churchill the way he treated Stalin, the British Empire would have been fine.
Absolutely. Right. So I don't know. I can't speak for Australia or New Zealand. What I will say is that they are more recent dominions. They're more recent Commonwealth nations of British stock. And I think that they have a harder time with a kind of indigenous colonial identity or fitting somewhere that is, sort of both British and Australian or Kiwi. I think they have a very hard time with that. But Canada, as it was called for a long time, is the eldest dominion. We're the oldest. We're sort of the big brother of the Commonwealth realms. And the seeds of our existence were born with the American Revolution. So I have always said that a distinct Anglo-Canadian identity kind of was already born in the fires of that conflict, valuing order and government and communitarianism and all of these other things, a distinct way of life, a distinct kind of ethos, a different species of North American. And then, of course, we have French Canadians who have always been there from the inception of our identity. The loyalists, the dance between English and French Canada has always kind of been there. It kind of makes us a distinct thing from the rest of the Commonwealth nations. People compare Canada to Australia quite a bit, its relationship with the Indigenous, or the First Nations. But I would say that our relationship is actually quite different. Because in Australia and New Zealand, there was far more tensions. Number one, between the First Nations there and the colonists. In Canada, we sort of had this kind of arm's length partnership.
Yeah.
Sometimes
it's very different. Yeah.
Sometimes we got along. Sometimes we didn't get along. Sometimes we made
depends on the tribe too.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. And it depends. It depends because there's quite more diversity of First Nations tribes in Canada than there is down there. There's a joke among Canadian nationalists. It's kind of an esoteric meme, which is like Angevin Empire. 1,000 year Angevin Empire, right? And the whole
that is esoteric, but I did get it. So
yeah, well, exactly, right. For those listening, the Angevin Empire was this like British-French kingdom. When the Anglo-Norman aristocracy of England invaded and conquered 2/3 of France,
Henry V and all that. If his kid had lived, what you conceivably could have had.
Well, their arms, the shield that represented that kingdom, it was partly the inspiration for the arms of Canada, with the English lions and the French fleur-de-lis, and that's a 600, almost 700-year-old symbol, and it was resurrected for Canada's sole and exclusive use in 1921. So there's this joke, like we are a kind of an neo-Angevin empire, sort of Angevin kingdom in the New World.
Yeah. So what in terms of the ordinary issues that Canadians seem to be furious about? Obviously, why do they keep supporting the Liberal Party? I mean, like I always say, in any kind of power structure, there's somebody who benefits. And if you look at the increase in real estate prices, obviously, I mean, not to pick on any particular generation, but your leaf-lib boomers are doing just fine under this. I mean, they are clearly profiting because of mass immigration, and what happens after this, they don't care. But beyond that, they seem to be the only people who are benefiting. I mean, it seems to be just an out-and-out catastrophe in terms of quality of life for everybody else. And yet, the Liberals still won. And I know people will be like, oh, well, Trump screwed it up. It's like, I don't know. I mean, you didn't see that in Japan. You didn't see that in a lot of other places where MAGA more or less like endorsed one side or the other. I mean, it seems like is it just the fact that the conservatives have just squandered it and you guys are going to have to come up with to break through and build this alternative like we've been discussing? Or do you think that the idea of breaking away from the way Canada's been governed since Trudeau, arguably, is just terrifying to too many people? Because again, this conservation of liberalism seems to be so core to the character at this point.
You've touched on many different things that all have an impact, that all sort of coalesce into this one thing. So I'll address the generational issue first. The baby boomer generation supported the flag change. A great many of them did. They got caught up in the 68ers, in the cultural revolution of the 60s and 70s that plagued the entire Western world. So that's one thing. So Liberal Canada is their Canada. Liberal Canada is their brainchild. It is the Canada that they know and love, that they identify with emotionally. It's that they identify with on a subconscious level. The other problem is that Canada has a media silo. As I mentioned before, the media and information centers in Canada are very centralized. And what are boomers? Well, they're the TV generation.
Right.
So all
you're
they
arguing
watch
with a boomer, you're arguing with the TV. The TV can't talk back.
Exactly. So they get all of their information from our state broadcaster. That's all they believe in. They've been out of the workforce for 20 to 30 years, so they don't know the economic situation. They can't empathize with Canadians, with young people. And overwhelmingly, they're the supporters of the Liberal Party.
Right.
If you look at statistics, it is the youth who overwhelmingly voted for the Conservatives, the youth and the middle-aged folks, whereas the old folks voted for the Liberal Party. And then the NDP, it's almost exclusively immigrants. It's it's fascinating. So that's the problem. The problem is that they're emotionally and psychologically invested in Pierre Trudeau's Canada, in the Liberal regime. They oversaw the regime change. They were at its peak. As far as they're concerned, Canada is a nation of immigrants. It is a culture mosaic, unified under a civic framework of English and French speaking folks and the First Nations and the indigenous. So that's one thing. As far as Polyev and the Trump situation, it's a bit of both of these things. I don't take the hyperbolic belief of Nima Parvini. I think it's a little bit hyperbolic to say that Trump and his saber rattling are destroying all of these right-wing movements abroad. I don't think it goes that far. I think that's a bit of an over-exaggeration. What I will say is that because
people tend not to like it when we threaten to invade you. I mean,
well, exactly. That's kind of the problem. And what I would compare this to is, what some people are noticing in the United States. A lot of people say that Trump is playing the role of the authoritarian, the base right-wing authoritarian,
without following through.
So, but the thing is, there's still a resistance to leftism in the United States. What this is doing in the imperial provinces like Canada and in Western Europe is activating and vitalizing these leftists while there's no active or strong resistance in these countries.
They're getting the enemy they think they wanted all along.
And
they think they're an Andor and whatever else.
And they're taking it out on local nationalists. They're using it as an excuse to consolidate power, to pass bills that censor the internet. They're attempting to grab firearms. They're attempting to add more firearm restrictions. They're exploiting the crisis to pretend to throw money at their military budgets, things like this, right? So that is the criticism that I would say. Of course, nominally, nobody wants to be threatened with annexation. In a way, I don't know. I think the only positive response out of that was we saw with the French far right, with Bardella, who said that we need to return to Gaullism. We need to have a strong, sovereign, militarily and economically independent France, and it is the liberals' fault that this is happening. I think that is that's the appropriate play. If not, and I've said this before too, that it is solely the fault of the Liberal Party that we are vulnerable to American imperialism. It was the liberals who dismantled the military. It was the liberals who put tampons in men's bathrooms. It was the liberals who inundate Canadian soldiers with anti-white vitriol. It is the Liberal Party who did all these things, right? So, hate the player, don't hate the game. I don't like it either. I don't like the threats, obviously, for my sovereignty. I don't think it's a good thing to join the States with how bad things are getting down there. But ultimately, it is the fault of the Liberal Party. So I would say that. And on to your final thing with Polyev, yes, he fumbled the ball. He fumbled the ball because Polyev is not a Canadian nationalist. Polyev doesn't know what a Canadian is. Our favorite question to these people is, what is a Canadian?
Yeah.
Oh, well, a Canadian is a citizen and they like hockey and Tim Hortons and Molson and Sleeman and they like to go tobogganing in the wintertime and it's someone with a passport and it's someone who accepts our values, which are never defined. Which are never.
And if they are, it's like tolerance and openness and multiculturalism.
Exactly.
Like that.
And it's just neoliberalism.
Our values are that we have no values.
It's just neoliberalism. It's just limited government, constitutionalism, freedom of movement, goods and services, all of this stuff, right? So there's no ideological difference between the Canadian Conservatives or, the Tories in the UK or really the Republicans in the United States, with the exception of the MAGA faction. I think the MAGA faction is ideologically different. But it's because they're not bringing anything to the table. There's nothing new. They have no vision for Canada. And because they're stuck defending Pierre Trudeau's conservatism. That's why they fumbled, right? So it was all of these things. It was kind of these four factors that drove the Conservatives to losing.
Last question, and I would note just in passing, a lot of the elbows up and you see this sort of stuff from the Europeans, oh, we're going to resist America. It's like, if you end up with President Gavin Newsom, God forbid, these same people are just going to drop to their knees overnight. And you're going to see like all of this talk about sovereignty and stuff. They're immediately going to jettison it. They just want Obama back.
So here's the thing.
His orders.
There's a joke up here, which is that if it was Kamala Harris threatening to annex Canada, every single one of these 51st staters would be at the border with their SKSs waiting for the invasion. And that's kind of, no, but for real.
Yeah. That's basically right. I mean, I guess the question becomes this, though, because obviously this is the big debate here, particularly because one way or another, the age of Trump is coming to an end and nobody really knows what's going to happen next. We'll see how the midterms shape up. Is the strategy to stay outside of partisan politics right now? Is it to try to take over the conservatives? Is it to try to build up an entirely new party? Or is this just something that you're going to wait for in the future? Because, I mean, at this point, it looks like the liberal government's going to be there for a while. But at some point, when you look at the demographic transformation, there is sort of a time limit here where the questions about Canadian identity versus American identity or any of these things kind of fall away, because then the only questions become, are you going to be Sikhs or Khalistan separatists or whatever else?
Yeah.
And we're facing the same thing. I mean, even Texas is going to be an Indian province if things keep up like this.
Everything's bigger in Texas, including your statue of the Hindu god Hanuman.
Yeah, exactly. Right. This is a Christian state. Like, well,
you got that, you got Hanuman, you got that all Muslim town or whatever. So, yeah.
Republican leadership, by the way. That's your American right wing, big tough right wing.
Texas's special relationship with India and the tech sector.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would say is, I mean, I can't comment on that obviously on our strategy, but I will say is that it kind of involves all of these. It's a multi-pronged assault. Everybody is everywhere. From every group, and there are already thousands of us, and momentum is building, and we're already forcing the national conversation in our direction. There's really nothing, for the same reason that the Freedom Convoy was such a hassle for the state, is the same reason that they won't really be able to stop the rise of Canadian nationalism. Canada wants to be Britain. It wants to be Australia. It does not have the manpower or the resources to chase after all of these people. So I'm very optimistic for the future.
It does seem like something real has started. And anyone who thinks that it can't go anywhere, look at what's happened in the United Kingdom just over the last few years. I mean, went from down bad to arguably the most promising movement in Europe.
I think Lowe is even further to the right than Trump is.
Oh, that's not even up for debate. I mean, Lowe is easily more right-wing than Trump. I mean, you could argue it's a little different because I think restores the ceiling that I've seen so far in terms of maximum support is like 10%, but you're still years away from a general election.
Yeah.
Trump, and obviously it's different in the States because you got the two-party system. So necessarily you're going to have a coalition that's a lot bigger, and therefore you've got more people at a part of it that you don't necessarily like, but you got to deal with if you want to win the thing. But we'll see. I mean, I think there was a poll a while back that showed pretty convincingly that the British public is actually more right-wing than the American public on immigration questions. It's just they haven't had the political expression before. But again, it's a different situation here.
I think that's quite plausible. Yeah.
I mean, and I say this as somebody who is still fundamentally very grateful for what Trump has been able to accomplish over the last decade, but we're going to have to move on one way or the other, whether they like it or not. So where can people find you and how can they help?
You can find me on X at Fortissax, as in 40 bags. You can also find me on Substack at Fortissax is typing.
And what about the Dominion?
Oh, Dominion Society.
That too, yeah.
You can look up dominionsociety.ca. And you can also Google the Second Sons website, and you'll find them. They both serve different purposes, but
just for people who are curious, what would be the distinction? The one is a fraternal group, the other one is more of a political forum.
It's a political activist group. Yeah, I would say that, focused on remigration and Canadian identity.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for joining. Again, sorry about the hockey jokes. And ultimately, I mean, I think if America, there's no situation, I've said this when it comes to all of our shared struggles, there's no situation where one country is going to survive and the other one dies. I mean, it's going to be all of us or none of us.
Yeah, at the same time. I'm reminded, and it was actually from back in the day, when Countercurrents and Radix were talking about Guillaume Faye, and he writes in Archaeofuturism, the whole convergence of catastrophes, where it's kind of all these things happening at the same time, predicted to be in the 2020s to the 2030s. I do agree that there will be a global cooperation between all of these nation states, these former nation states.
I agree.
Yeah, so.
All right. Thank you for joining us on Identity Politics, and good luck in your efforts to save the Great White North.
Thank you for your time, Kevin. I appreciate it.
So, about the time you're seeing this, we're getting ready for President Trump to give the State of the Union. Where's the state of the Trump administration, I guess, is the real question. Now, there's going to be the usual theatrics. A lot of the Democrats are boycotting it. They're doing their own event. Frankly, why are they even there? I think the U.S. hockey team is going to be there. There's people attacking them for saying, oh, they should have condemned the president or something like that. None of that's particularly important. You are seeing the president try to shift gears in terms of the debate right now. He had an event with the so-called angel moms, which are the parents of people who have been killed by illegal aliens. The press basically refused to cover it, made fun of it, even on CNN, said it wasn't a big deal. But you can see that the Trump administration is trying to lean into the immigration issue. They are trying to duplicate what was recently done in Minneapolis, where you're not going to do the shock and awe type thing with ICE, but you're going to quietly go in there and go after the people that you want, and even use subterfuge and deception to get the people that you want. Because, again, this has been dropped. But if you look at the reports from the left-wingers on the ground, they're freaking out, because they understand ICE is still in Minneapolis and is still getting the people that they want. And now they're going to do this everywhere. You're probably going to see them pivot a little bit to the fraud investigation, because obviously they're going to be using that to go after Gavin Newsom now that they've basically taken Tim Walz out. But all of this sort of fades away compared to two things. One, of course, is Iran. Now, is something going to happen there? I mean, this is sort of the thing. We could speculate all day long, like, oh, well, obviously this is going to happen and everything else. Now, you don't send that amount of military force into the Middle East unless you're willing to use it. But they are trying to negotiate something. And what does use military force mean? If they send a few missiles, drop a few bombs, I mean, this literally already happened. This is not World War III. But you can imagine it turning into this. And frankly, I don't put it past Trump to do something like that, like announce it at the State of the Union or something like that. So we just have to wait and see. But I'm not going to speculate on it until we actually see what's going to happen. Second thing I think is actually more important in terms of the midterms, which is fundamentally this is about the cost of living. This is about the economy. This is about the fact that the president does not have the power fundamentally to shift the federal spending in such a way that you can actually stop inflation. And he's already said, and this is one of my criticisms of him, that we're not really going to do anything on housing costs beyond maybe getting some immigrants out of here, because we don't want housing costs to go down, because that will jeopardize the real estate values of the boomers. Again, this is the same sort of thing that you see up in Canada. We're basically held hostage by these economic interests who benefit from the system the way it is. And this, of course, also includes businesses which benefit from cheap labor. This includes, of course, agriculture. This includes hospitality. This includes all these other industries, which, again, President Trump has said we are not going to strictly enforce immigration law on these things. Now, some of that might be rhetoric. He is actually cracking down in some ways, but you're not seeing the kind of shock and awe to shut down like meatpacking plants or something like that. The problem here is that the president is laying out an agenda that I think actually is going to make the country better, but only if you were running it for like 20 years. This is very slow. This is slow progress. This is maybe the most you can do within the system, but you're not really going to see returns for it for a long time. Even with something like tariffs, and I know the Supreme Court ruled against them, but then he just put new tariffs on with a new law, so it doesn't really matter. Even with something like tariffs, maybe it'll raise some revenue. There might be some short-term price increases, but in theory, this is how you bring manufacturing back. But you're not going to get that for a few years. I mean, for one thing, businesses need to see that it's actually going to stick around and this isn't just a temporary thing. I think fundamentally the problem is that the system of government that we have right now is just not capable of meeting these challenges. And so people are going to turn on the Trump administration in the midterms out of frustration that they're not getting the instant solutions they want. And of course, this is historically the case. It could be anybody in the White House. You're probably going to lose the House in the midterm elections because that's what always happens. And then what's going to happen? You're going to have people come in, they're going to cripple immigration law enforcement, they're going to do all these things, but more broadly, you're going to get what you get in New York City. You're going to get a different population, you're going to get a replacement of the existing American population, you're going to get some vague rhetoric about, we're going to tax the billionaires and create some social programs. The social programs are all basically just fraud, as we've seen in Minnesota, and then you're basically paying off your political supporters, and life becomes that much worse for white, middle class, and working class Americans. And this is the trap that we're in, because there's not really a political solution to that. Where does this leave us? I do not think Trump is going to cross the Rubicon. I do not think it is possible for Trump to cross the Rubicon. I think it's pretty hypocritical for people who didn't even vote for him to complain that he's not becoming like a fascist dictator. Well, who are you to lecture him what he should and should not do? Where were you when it mattered? But fundamentally, he is in a situation where the cost of short-term inaction and the cost of drastic action are basically the same. Like, you have nothing to lose. You may have noticed that the former president of South Korea was just sentenced to jail for a very long time for trying a failed coup. Now, South Korea is another one of these political systems which is basically paralyzed. In this case, it's mostly over gender, but a lot of the issues are basically the same. What happens if you go fishing in the Rubicon? That's the worst possible thing. Where the Trump administration is right now is they've basically given the left the enemy they want. You can call him a fascist, you can call him an authoritarian, you can point to a couple things, but there's no actual cost for opposing him. Like, no one's going to jail for criticizing the president. No one even pays an economic price. You may still pay an economic price for supporting the president. Like, this is the actual situation that we're in. Ultimately, that is the calculation that needs to be reversed. Now, giving advice to the president seems pretty arrogant, but if I had to do one thing right now, if I had one measure, other than the things which we all would say, which is, enforce immigration law more strongly and maybe do this on tariffs and whatever else, I would say the biggest thing that he's broached, and the GOP is not going to like it, but if you can find a way to do it through the executive, just do it. Give people those tariff rebates. Put money in the pockets of ordinary Americans. I know you could say that's inefficient. I know you could say that's not the best way to do things. I know you could say, oh, well, actually, we got to pay down the debt because that's the only way to stop inflation. None of this matters. This is a democracy. And to win in a democracy, you need to build a base of clients. And people need to see that with this guy in office, they have more money in their pocket. And I know it's frustrating because so many other things are more important. Defense policy, what's happening in the Middle East, immigration, all these other things. But fundamentally, most people are going to vote on the question of, do they have more money or not? Because that is what people are. Democracy appeals to the stomach, not the heart. And that's why President Trump needs to put money in Americans' pockets so he can get about the business of actually saving the country. I'll see you next time. All right, guys, that's it for today's episode of Identity Politics. If you found this valuable and you want to see more of this kind of work, here's how you can help. First, follow the show and share it with people who need to hear it. We're on Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, X, TikTok, and you can also grab the RSS feed. Sharing it is the fastest way for us to grow. Second, sign up for our email list so we can always stay in direct contact no matter what the platforms decide. And most importantly, if you believe in our mission and want to keep it going, please consider supporting us on Ko-Fi. You can donate once or subscribe at the bronze, silver, gold, or white level. Every contribution, big or small, helps keep Identity Politics independent and alive. All the links are in the description below. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting. We'll see you next time.